I am super excited to be talking to you about the Vajrayana tradition today. This is actually the tradition that I practice, so I finally feel like I'm on home turf. Hello, Claudia. Hello. I first got into Tibetan Buddhism, I think it must have been 1997, and I got into it by taking a class as an undergrad at Rice University with the amazing Dr. Anne Klein, who is my Lama now. And so I really got into Vajrayana Buddhism through like the intellectual side, like the history, the philosophy, all that stuff. I just found it so fascinating. But in the beginning, if you know, as you watched the Theravada talk, I really was more into like meditating and practicing from the Theravada side just because it seemed simpler, it seemed less like religious. So we're going to talk about Tibetan and, Vajrayana Buddhism today. It is much more like oriented toward Buddhas and depictions of Buddhas, meditating on them and stuff like that. So it feels a bit more devotional. That's one of the strong characteristics of Vajrayana type practice. So I think it's going to be interesting to dive in. It's pretty different from the forms of Buddhism that came before, but you could really say that about every form of Buddhism. So the first thing that I want to talk about is this little map at the top of the guide to Vajrayana Buddhism. And this map points, it has all these arrows that kind of show you the diffusion of Buddhism throughout Asia. And of course, nowadays, the arrows will point like all over the world because Buddhism is everywhere. But the arrows come from India because obviously that's where Buddhism originated. They sort of go to the northwest and then sort of up and across the Taklamakan Desert into China, so kind of following the Silk Route. You also see the diffusion of Buddhism to the east, so going to China, going on to the rest of East Asia. And what we're going to talk about today is the diffusion of multiple forms of Buddhism into Tibet and then from Tibet into other places. And I want to say a couple of things before I dive in. First of all, pretty much all forms of Mahayana Buddhism seem to have a Vajrayana element to them. So as far as I know, and I did do a PhD on Buddhism at Rice, but that doesn't mean I know everything about the tradition. So as far as I know, Japanese Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism, Korean Buddhism, Vietnamese Buddhism, all these forms do have a tantric element included in them. So you'll find mantras, you find what are called mandalas, so, circular drawings depicting like the realm of a given Buddha. So all of these are elements of Vajrayana Buddhism, but it's really only in Tibet and the Himalayan regions around it that Vajrayana became the primary form of Dharma that you see practiced. So when I talk about Vajrayana Buddhism, I just want to, I hope that you keep in mind there's a giant asterisk beside that really this is found all over Asia, obviously all over the world now, but I'm talking about the societies in which the Vajrayana form of Buddhism became dominant. And even, I think people often equate Vajrayana Buddhism with Tibet. And that's reasonably accurate because Tibet is sort of the largest society where Vajrayana Buddhism just permeates the culture. But as, I think it's Jamgon Kongtrul, the great Lama of the 1800s in Tibet, he actually uses the word Himalayan Buddhism because it includes Bhutan, for instance. It includes the sort of northern region of Nepal, which borders up against Tibet and is very, very similar to Tibet in terms of culture. It includes areas like Sikkim and Ladakh, which are part of India, but they're very, again, closely tied to Tibetan culture. So people speak forms of Tibetan there, and they do forms of Vajrayana practice that are very similar to what you find in Tibet. So I just, again, want to say, the scholar in me has to say, like, when I talk about Tibetan Buddhism, really it's more accurate to talk about Himalayan Buddhism, but people are not familiar with that term, and I don't want to confuse people if they join, 10 minutes from now and they're like, Himalayan Buddhism, what are you talking about? So anyway, I just want to explain some of the language that I'm using and why, when we talk about Vajrayana Buddhism, I'll use the word Tibet, But really, I hope you think more inclusively about it as, you know, something that's found in almost all Mahayana traditions, and that also became the dominant tradition in other areas in the Himalayas too. But those areas do tend to be very similar culturally to Tibet. All right, so having gone through all of that, let us start with a little bit of history. And actually, if you have the little resources on Vajrayana guide in front of you, you'll see that I included a Venn diagram of Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana Buddhism. There's a lot of stuff that all three of these forms of Buddhism have in common. So everybody takes the Four Noble Truths as being like core foundational truths of the tradition. Everybody has a form of monasticism. A lot of the philosophical innovations of the Mahayana and Vajrayana schools really are built on the insights of the Buddha, so they're shared with the Theravada school as well. So I just want to say that when I'm talking about Vajrayana, I'm talking about the things that are distinctive, but there's this whole core of belief and practice and all this good stuff that is shared among all schools of Buddhism. And just because I'm not talking about that stuff that everybody has in common, that doesn't mean that it's not, you know, like the majority of what you're going to find in any given Buddhist tradition. Okay, so having said that, let's talk a little bit about the timeline. So y'all know that I love history. I'm kind of a nerd that way. So I want to go back to the history of the development of Buddhism generally to talk about the development of the Vajrayana schools. So first of all, just a very brief review. We know that Buddhism started about 500, 550 BCE in northern India when the person formerly known as Prince Siddhartha became enlightened. So the Buddha means the awakened one. It is a title. Okay, so about 500, 550 BCE, we have the beginning of the Buddhist tradition. About 300 years later, 200 to 300 years later, we have Buddhism beginning to spread all throughout northern and southern India with the reign of Emperor Ashoka. Then around the turn of the modern era, the time of Christ, we have the development of the Mahayana school of Buddhism. And the only tradition that survives from the earliest forms of Buddhism is now called Theravada. So that is one major important branch of Buddhism. Mahayana schools developed on the basis of earlier teachings. They developed some new ideas about Buddhahood, emptiness, that kind of thing, but they share still most of the teachings of early forms of Buddhism in common. And then when we get to about 500 CE, we begin to see the origins of Vajrayana, or it's also sometimes called Tantric Buddhism, in India. And scholars, well, I haven't done the research lately, but as of about 5 years ago, scholars weren't 100% sure how Tantric Buddhism really got started. So one theory is that with the Mahayana, you have all these different Buddhas, all these different bodhisattvas, beings who are sort of traveling the path toward awakening, and you have a lot of devotional practices where people are maybe saying the mantras of these Buddhas, or they're making offerings. Mantras, by the way, are extremely old. They're older even than Buddhism itself. So it's not that only the Vajrayana has mantras. Actually, there are mantras in the Theravada tradition too. It's just they become a really focal point. They're used in a different way in Vajrayana that we're going to talk about later, that I'm going to talk about, and you can ask questions in the chat if you have questions about it. So you start to see these developments in Mahayana Buddhism, and probably that's part of what helped to lay the foundations for Vajrayana Buddhism. Another thing that may have influenced the beginnings of Tantric Buddhism is that in all the cultures where Buddhism has ever taken root, including definitely India, there's a very strong shamanic tradition. And when I say shamanic, this is a word that's almost as misunderstood as Tantra, But what I mean by shamanic is that people believe in what we might call like supernatural beings or forces. So they believe that there are spirits of the land, spirits of the water, spirits of the mountains, stuff like that. So like everywhere that humans live is full of other types of spirits and beings too. So when I talk about shamanism, what I'm talking about is ways that people interact with the unseen world. And one of the features of Tantric Buddhism is that, and again, I'm going to talk about this later too, so don't worry if you don't understand all of it right now, but people begin to do practices focused on specific Buddhas and the sort of energies that those Buddhas have, that we also have. So for instance, there is Avalokiteshvara. You're probably familiar with his mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum. Very famous mantra. And there's a peaceful version of Avalokiteshvara, but there's also a wrathful version. And what people start doing with particularly these wrathful Buddhas is people believed that various supernatural spirits and demons and things like that could be responsible for illness and for deaths in people's children and their families and their cattle, and their crops could even be affected by these supernatural beings. So one of the things that people kind of use tantric practice for is those sorts of concerns, those like everyday concerns. So people will do the practice of like a wrathful Buddha and imagine themselves as that wrathful Buddha, and then use the power of that Buddha to kind of suppress or to drive out these negative forces like spirits or demons or whatever. And you see that that's always been a part of what happens with tantric practice. So I just want to make it clear that, you know, when we talk about tantra, I'll be talking for the most part about sort of elite practice where people are oriented toward liberation. But part of the reason that people have always been really into Tantra is that they also see ways that it helps, that it can benefit their daily life too. So like nowadays, a lot of people, when they hear the word Tantra, they think like sex, and that Tantra is all about like having better sex or something like that. So that's part of the reason I didn't write Tantra as the title of this talk, because people tend to misunderstand it. So that's kind of where we often go with Tantra. Back in the day, people would go to, can you heal illness? You know, can you maybe dispel hailstorms? That's one thing that could cause crop failures in Tibet. So people would sometimes use these tantric practices to try to, you know, push out the demons that would cause hailstorms. So there's a very practical aspect of it. Okay, so to come back to the history of this, people become really interested in Tantra, partly for liberative reasons, partly for these more sort of day-to-day reasons, and it becomes more and more widespread in Indian Buddhism. And again, as we saw when Mahayana developed alongside Theravada, often people in one monastery might be doing like mainstream Mahayana practice, but then on the side they might also have a tantric practice. And in the beginning, all forms of Buddhist Tantra were really supposed to be kept secret. But what happened was everybody was really into them, you know? So lay people who maybe didn't necessarily have the time or the skill or the expertise to practice these things themselves will want maybe monastics or very dedicated lay practitioners to do practice for them. So there was really this confluence of different people doing these practices, different reasons that people were interested in these practices, but they're definitely growing in popularity. So the other thing that starts happening in Indian Buddhist history around the time of the rise of the Vajrayana is waves of invasions of nomadic people. They're Muslims. They are not having it with Hindu and Buddhist deities. There's just like so many deities in both of these traditions. So they started like destroying monasteries, destroying monastic universities. And basically, by about 700 years later, so maybe the 12th to 13th to definitely by the 14th century of the Common Era in India, you have really the waning of the influence of Buddhism in general Indian society. But in about the 7th century, you have the spread of Buddhism beginning into Tibet. And by the 8th century of the Common Era, Buddhism is really taking hold in Tibet. I hope y'all can see. Can you just drop a comment if the stream is still going okay? I keep getting notified that my internet access is not good, so I apologize. Usually it's fine, and then, every now and then it just drops off. Okay, so Buddhism begins to come to Tibet. Claudia says it's fine now. Okay, awesome. And as Buddhism comes into Tibet, they get a whole bunch of different strands. Like, if you think about it, by the 7th century of the Common Era in India, you have just a wide diversity of... Oh, Vagabond says the sound is fine, video is a bit choppy. Syl says it's a bit slow sometimes, but it's okay. Okay, I'm so glad to hear that. I'm going to stop interrupting myself. Also, I will be posting this video on YouTube at some point. I find that if the videos are really long, they're kind of too long for YouTube, so I've been cutting them up, and, I've been a little slower in getting them out because I've been editing too, but this will be on YouTube later, and if you're on the list, the mailing list on types of Buddhism, then I'll send you links as the videos become available. I'll probably also end up doing them as podcast episodes and maybe put them also in audio form on Insight Timer so everybody can access them in whatever way works for you. So anyway, Tibet is receiving Buddhism from really two main cultural sources. They're receiving it in the beginning really from the Silk Road, so it's not coming directly from India or from China. But the two major cultural centers that Tibet is located between are India and China. And they received some influences from both of those, but pretty early in the diffusion of Buddhism into Tibet, they specifically chose to go with Indian Buddhism. So Tibet really looks to India to trace their Buddhist lineage, and really until Buddhism completely collapsed in India, there were still... In the beginning, there were lots of people going from Tibet to India. They were inviting teachers from India to Tibet, so there was a lot of contact across that border. The Himalayas, it's a very daunting border between these two places, but people were making that trip. They would risk their lives to go and learn about the Dharma and bring texts and teachings to Tibet. So that really dropped off a lot in about the 9th century of the Common Era, when the Tibetan Empire that had kind of come together and initiated the spread, this contact with India and China, that empire collapsed. But really, contact continued between Tibet and India for the next 600 years until about the 14th century, when finally there's just pretty much an end to Buddhism as a separate tradition in India. So there's a long period of transmission, and again, as we saw with the Mahayana schools, in Tibetan Buddhism and in Vajrayana Buddhism generally, they accept all the core principles of the Mahayana. So if you have your resources page in front of you, there's a couple of sections. Vajrayana builds on the Mahayana beliefs. So the ideas of bodhicitta that I think I did a separate Insight Timer talk on it. I know I have a YouTube video on it. The idea of bodhicitta, like the intention to awaken in order to liberate all beings from all suffering. So that's still really a key element of Vajrayana Buddhism. The ideas also of emptiness and Buddhahood or Buddha nature are going to be foundational. So I want to actually go through what's new about Vajrayana Buddhism by explaining how it takes these earlier concepts of emptiness and Buddha nature and keeps them But basically, I want to explore those themes through the practice of deity yoga. And that is, I mean, Tantric Buddhism, there's a lot of different types of practices. So we could spend a whole session just going through some of those types of practices, but honestly, some of them are pretty advanced. Some of them, if you don't really have a foundation in Buddhism, they may not make a lot of sense. So I'm just going to talk about this one, deity yoga. And to me, this is what I think of as sort of like the heart of Vajrayana Buddhist practice. And I'll take one example, just Green Tara, because she's the one whose practice I have done the most. So Green Tara, for instance, when you do her practice, you begin by imagining that she's in front of you. So you're inviting her to like join you. You're imagining that there's like a sort of a beautiful lotus with a cushion on it for her to sit on. So you're inviting her to come and join you. You make offerings to her. And then you imagine that basically she's blessing you. And part of what's important about this whole practice is you start with the Buddha out there, but you end up recognizing that it's in here too. So she sends you blessings, and then what happens is you sort of imagine that everything dissolves just into its natural state of emptiness. Everything dissolves into light. She dissolves into light, you dissolve into light, and when you arise back up again out of that, state of just emptiness, you've taken the form of Green Tara. Josky says, a monk said that this tantric elements were like a skin that you put over the body. I'd want to hear some more about that to like be able to really understand what that means. But basically, Tantra has the same motivation as Mahayana. And it has even most of the same understandings of the world. But it's using a very different form of practice to access that. So as you do this deity yoga practice, you send out, so you've become Tara now, or whatever deity you're practicing. You send out her enlightened love and compassion in all directions. You're imagining sending beams of light out as you say her mantra. So you are kind of accessing your Buddha nature to try and share with all beings. To relieve their suffering, to offer them happiness, to offer them wisdom and liberative insight. And then everybody else, as they're touched by these beams, they also transform into Tara. And then at the end of the recitation period, you feel that all of you, like it's just a Tara-verse now. So this is what people are depicting when they draw figures of Buddhas on tankas. It's a symbolic way of saying, you're Tara, I'm Tara, the cat outside is Tara, my worst enemy is Tara. We're all basically made of the same enlightened nature. So after you've suffused the entire universe with that understanding, that intention, now everything dissolves. It's not just you that dissolves, the entire cosmos dissolves. And it sort of dissolves from the outside in until there's just kind of a drop of light. And then that dissolves too. And there's just spaciousness, and you rest in that as long as you can. And then as soon as thoughts and whatever else starts coming up again, then you imagine that once again you're arising out of that state of complete emptiness as Tara. And I should just say, we're all empty all the time, but we're not usually aware of it. So maybe it would be more accurate to say you arise out of that state of awareness of emptiness, and you're still Tara, and everyone around you is still Tara. So I wanted to just walk you through sort of a typical tantric practice so that we can talk about it. Because if I'm just saying like, oh, when you dissolve into light, that's emptiness, I think it doesn't really connect. And I'm curious to know in the comments, does anyone do tantric practice? Like, is this already familiar to y'all, or is it like really new? Okay, so now we have that as an example. So the way that this type of practice, Joski says, love Tara. Yeah, me too. Raven says new. Susan says really new. Keith says new to me. Okay, so all right. I didn't want to be boring y'all with like just going over the basics, but yeah, it's a really profound form of practice. It's also, by the way, a form of practice that works best, or maybe works fully or properly, if you've been introduced to that deity by a qualified lama. So that's the reason that like you're not going to see me leading like a full, Tara practice on Insight Timer, because it's really something, it's almost like, I don't know, studying calculus or something. Like, until you know certain parts of how math works, and until you've been introduced to certain concepts that are not just intuitive, you're not, I mean, it's like me in high school taking AP calculus. Like, I kind of got it, but not really. And so I just want to explain, why you're not likely to see like a full-on tantric practice being led on Insight Timer. But it's totally worth doing and pursuing if it's something you're interested in. Feel free to message me, and we can see if maybe there are resources or a sangha or a teacher or something in your area that might be good. There's also a lot of people doing wonderful stuff online. So again, if you're interested, drop me a message and I can refer you to some of the folks I love. My teachers at Dawn Mountain, they offer a program called Dzogchen Cycles. So if you're interested in like diving into like the really legit, awesome, tantric practice, I recommend checking them out at dawnmountain.org. Dave says, I've studied calculus. Yeah, it's hard to make an analogy to Tantra because it's so embodied. Maybe actually martial arts would be a better analogy. Like I could watch a YouTube video. I studied Kung Fu for a long time, for, I don't know, 7 or 8 years. I could watch a YouTube video and like kind of learn a form and like go through it on my own, but without somebody there to say, yeah, but if you just tilt your, if you angle your arm slightly this way, it's going to work better. And when you do this, it needs to have that type of energy. When you have that kind of like personal teaching, it just works much better. So, emptiness is one of the key philosophical underpinnings of all Mahayana thought. And as we can see with this deity yoga example, you're still accessing emptiness just through a tantric practice. So when you dissolve into light, into emptiness, into reality itself, when Tara dissolves into reality itself, you're not separate from Tara. And this is the thing that you realize. In a big part of the beginnings, oh, thank you so much. Sil just donated. Thank you. I keep forgetting to mention that. We're supposed to mention like 2 to 3 times in each session that you can donate, and that it's really helpful, and I usually forget until the end. So thank you very much. The really important part of the beginning stage of tantric practice is about letting your ordinary sense of self dissolve. If I think I am here and I am like this deficient human running around just trying to like get my act together and buy groceries and like take out the trash today, that doesn't feel at all like I'm Tara. And it's really important that we understand that we are Tara. That we can manifest as Tara taking out the trash and Tara getting the groceries. So this beginning stage of deity yoga practice that I described, where you're dissolving into light, Tara dissolves into light, there's emptiness, and then you kind of arise as Tara, and you're feeling yourself as green, or she has all these different colors. You might be orange, you might be black, you might be red. So you feel yourself as this like colorful, completely wise, and completely compassionate Buddha. And that's not how we usually feel. And this is why tantric practice is different from ordinary practice, or from sutric practices based on the sutras, rather than going stepwise and kind of analytically thinking, okay, emptiness means I am not my body, I am not my mind. is this tooth me? Is this tooth me? Is this tooth me? Instead of that, just all at once, we're dissolving our ordinary sense of self and arising as a Buddha. And the purpose of that is special insight. So if you remember in the Theravada session, I talked about samatha, calm abiding, and vipassana, special insight. So the way that the Tibetan tradition is getting at emptiness, at special insight, seeing into the nature of reality, is to just do it experientially, to just become Tara, and then you feel what it's like to be empty, to be wise, to be compassionate. So that's one really important part of how tantric practice addresses the same things as Mahayana. The other thing I want to say here, because really in tantric practice it becomes clear that emptiness and Buddha nature, I was going to say they're the two sides of the same coin, but they're not even, it's not even that. It's almost like, are you looking at it with one eye or are you looking at it with the other eye? It's the same thing. So when you arise as Tara, you can't be holding a solid sense of self. Even Tara is not a solid sense of self. She is made of light. You know, if Tara wanted to walk through this wall, she would just do it. So it's really designed to crack open this sense that there's Buddhas and there's me, and I'm not that. So this is where we start to have the identification with a Buddha, and not in the sense of like, you know, puffing up our ego or like feeding our narcissism of like, I am a Buddha and I'm pretty awesome. Everyone's a Buddha, okay? Like mosquitoes are Buddhas. I mean, whoever you like or dislike or hate the most in the entire world, Hitler was a Buddha. He was a very obscured Buddha, did some harmful things, but like everyone has that Buddha nature according to this teaching. And sooner or later, everybody's going to peel off those layers of gunk and come to rest in that Buddha nature. And we're doing it through tantric practice, just in a faster way. And in the beginning, if we're beginners, obviously, we might be faking it. We might be like pretending, what would it feel like to be a Buddha? But the more you repeat these practices, the more it kind of begins to sink in, the more you're able to kind of at least experiment with living as a Buddha. And that is why in Tibetan Buddhism, before you even do tantric practice, there's what are called the foundational practices, or ngondro. And in those, you spend a lot of time really engaged with basic forms of essentially tantric practice. So purification practices, doing the kind of deity yoga practice I just described, but you're doing it with your own teachers, your own lineage, to really receive those blessings so that you kind of begin to crack open that shell of small self enough to even start making contact with these sacred, powerful forces of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Oh man, I feel like I'm just geeking out on it now. So that sense of Buddhahood, connecting with all that spiritual potential that we have, but doing it very quickly, all of that is really foundational to the tantric approach to Buddhist practice. So I think I've actually covered everything that was on the little resource sheet for this week, but I do want to just add on like a postscript, which is that obviously Tibetan or Himalayan or Vajrayana forms of Buddhism have now spread all over the world. The Dalai Lama, obviously Tibetan Buddhist, Pema Chodron, whose writings have been really influential, Tibetan Buddhist. There's just all these really famous figures, and some kind of infamous figures as well, who are coming from this tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. So it's not, I think, it's not as foundational for like the mindfulness tradition, for instance, as Theravada Buddhism is, but it's definitely influenced the ways that people think about practice. And for instance, there's a program called Compassion Cultivation Training, which was developed at Stanford University, and that is a secular form of basically Tibetan compassion practices. It was developed by the guy who used to translate for the Dalai Lama, Thupten Jinpa. So these Tibetan ideas are finding their ways into our society, and I kind of want to go out on a little bit of a metaphysical limb here, I guess, and say I feel like that shamanic element of Tibetan Buddhism, where we learn how to live with greater harmony with our earth and our surroundings, and how we learn about things like death and what happens after death so we can relax a little bit, maybe be less afraid of the death process. I feel like those are things that in our modern society we've lost a lot of the wisdom that we used to have, whether we're talking about, for instance, medieval Europe and all the folklore and all the wisdom that kind of got stomped out by the scientific revolution, or if we're talking about other places, there's so many languages that die out every day now, and so many cultures that are, really being homogenized into sort of global culture. Everybody's watching like films from the US now, and even in, other countries like in China or India, there's just so many traditions that are being lost as everybody modernizes. And I feel like one of the things Tibetan Buddhism and these Vajrayana traditions in general really have to offer us is a connection to the sacred that I'm not going to say, like these supernatural beings or whatever are like true in a literal sense, but I mean, some of them might be. Who am I to say what's true and what's not true? But, I do think that the more we can consider, well, what if this land had a spirit in it? Would what I'm doing be like upsetting it? Do I have permission to start digging? Maybe I should make an offering and just let the land know, let the spirits know, hey, I'm going to be putting this thing in. I'd like your permission. Here's an offering, so that we're not just doing whatever we want to the earth and to each other and to animals and whatnot. So that was my soapbox. But does anybody have questions or comments or topics from this talk or the other talks I've done in this series that you'd like to do a deeper dive on? And I know there's a little bit of a delay, so it's going to be a while before any comments come in. So I just want to thank you so much, everybody who has tuned in to this series of teachings. Josky says, beautiful. Thank you, Josky. This is my fourth, he says, very much like Native American attitude. Yeah, exactly. I think any culture that had a deep tie with the land had their own ways of thinking about these things. And it's such a huge loss that, I don't want to say we've lost these things like forever, but I mean, it's not something you're like allowed to talk about. Part of the reason that I opted out of academia after I got my PhD was because I want to be able to talk about reincarnation and spirits of the land. And, I can't write that stuff and publish it and keep an academic job and get laughed at. And there's just so many ways that our society keeps us from talking about these things. But they're true, they're real. People have dealt with, the unknown, the unseen world since there were humans. And we don't know everything. We don't know what's there and what's not there definitively. So anyway, I feel very passionate about that. Oh, thank you, Keith. Keith just made a donation. Mana says, it's interesting the word shaman appears all over. Buddhist bhikkhus were also called shramana. Yeah, so shramana is not related to shaman. Shaman comes from sort of like North Central Asia, from actually Siberia, and it's not a term that traditionally would have been used in, well, I was about to say any Buddhist areas, maybe Mongolia, but yeah, the words are not related, but the concept, I think it's so fundamental that it doesn't even really appear in like Buddhist sutras. It would be like for us, like Christianity doesn't have to say, gravity exists, because everybody knows that. Yeah, sorry, I get really passionate about this, so maybe I should do a whole separate talk on it. What I was trying to do was review. We've gone on this whole journey through the origins of Buddhism, a little bit of a historical overview of the tradition. We talked about the Theravada branches of the Buddhist tree. I talked about Mahayana. Now I've talked about Vajrayana. So again, if you're interested in, I'm still working on processing like the Mahayana video. This one is probably going to be a couple of weeks before I get any of this stuff posted. So I just want to say, if you're interested in getting emails about it, I'll be sending out some emails as I get this stuff, you know, up and ready to be seen. And at the top of the page that I just posted a link to, there's a little like registration box where you can get on a mailing list if you want to get those updates. It's also something I'm considering doing a teaching series about in the spring. So if you're interested in maybe doing a couple of workshops or a program, not on Insight Timer, just me doing it, you might also like register for updates on that. I won't be sending a bunch of emails. I'm just going to send things that are relevant to that specific topic. Every now and then, if there's something I think y'all might be interested in that's related, but it's not exactly that, I might send an email too, but it's not like a spam list. Whew, okay. So I mostly want to say thank you for joining me. I hope that this series of talks has helped to make it clear how these different traditions fit together, why each of them is really cool and has something distinctive to offer, but also how much they have in common. And I hope it's helped, for anyone who's trying to figure out which branch of the Buddhist tree you want to climb onto and make a home on. I hope it's been helpful for you to kind of have a little bit more information to consider that. If you're not following me on Insight Timer, please feel free to follow so that you get notified when I do talks or meditations. I'm actually going to be taking a couple of weeks off. I'm about to do some travel and stuff like that. Also, this series has been a lot of work, so I'm gonna take a couple of weeks off from doing this. I might schedule a couple of meditations over the next few weeks, or even a short talk or something. Josky, I feel like I should be paying you. Josky is such a good person to remind people of how to stay connected. Yeah, if you feel like making a donation, that is lovely. It's super helpful. So thank you for joining. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon or morning or whatever time it is for you there. And I hope we connect again in the future. Okay, bye.